Welcome everyone. So today is a Sunday and normally we take quarantine clinics, but today I thought that we'll take something different. So it'll be related to neuroscience, but it'll be something that even our colleagues from non-medical professions are also interested in. So today we'll be taking a brief discussion on memory, and we'll be talking about what is memory and how memory has evolved over um, uh, biology, over species, and basically what is the role of memory. And we'll also be talking about how we can improve our memory. So let's get started right away. As we know, memory is important to all of us. So even when I was deciding which about this topic, and I asked people if would they be interested in memory, the commonest response that I got was that yes, I would love to hear about memory. I want to know how I can improve my memory. So memory is something that is important to us. We take great pride in our own memory, and if we forget something, we tend to get embarrassed by it. Uh, Probably one of the things that embarrasses us the most is if we are at a wedding and there's some relative who comes to us and says, "Hey, do you remember me?" And if you can't remember, that's a nightmare scenario for all of us. So we find memory a important part of our daily lives. But in order to understand what is memory, we need to sort of understand about ourselves, about the human body. So let's just have a look at ourselves for a second. Now imagine that this is you. Now, right from your birth, like your entire life, basically, right from your birth to your childhood, to your adulthood, old age, death, all throughout your life basically consists of you and the environment, and some form of interaction between the two, right? So how does the body and the environment interact with each other? Basically, we are able to perceive the environment through our senses. So which are the senses that we have? We can perceive the environment through sound, through sight, through smell, through touch, and through taste. So when we perceive the environment, what this basically means is that there is some form of input, and after there is input, there will be some form of output. So what this basically does is, if there is an environment and there is you, there is a continuous flow of input and there's a continuous outflow. And this goes on throughout our existence. Now, what happens if our output does not change? So what happens if every time there is an input, we give out the same output? Then that would mean that there is no change in our actions. So that means there's no change in our outcome, and ultimately there will be no evolution. But we know that that is not what happens. We know that in life, when you get multiple experiences, our response to those experiences keep changing. So why is that? So for example, suppose you get an input the first time and then you get it again and again and again. The next time you get the same experience, your output may be slightly different. And the next time you get it, it may again be different by some more margin. So each time your experience repeats itself, your output may keep changing. Now, the reason for this is that we learn. So human beings have an intrinsic capacity to learn from our past experiences and change the output every time you get that input. And the reason that we are able to learn is because we have memory. Okay. So in a way, you can say that memory is a capacity to hold information to change output, okay, based on previous experiences. Now, this is a rough definition, but I think it would suffice for the sake of this discussion. So again, let's go over it. Memory, it is a capacity to hold information to change the output. Now, memory does not guarantee that your output will change, but you need memory to even have a chance of changing the output. Okay. Now, we know that human beings have that capacity. Okay. What about animals? Can animals also do this? And the answer is yes, of course, animals can do this. Some of us have pets. We know that pets can be trained. Uh, if you remember, there was a famous experiment that happened sometime in the 18th century, or rather the end of the 19th century, so 1890s, by a Russian scientist named Pavlov. So Pavlov conclusively proved that animals do have memory and animals can be trained, because he did this experiment where he trained a dog to associate the sound of a ringing bell with uh, food. So he kept giving the dog food and ringing the bell to the point where even if the dog wasn't given food and he just heard the bell, he would start salivating. And Pavlov called this a conditioned reflex. So by conditioned reflex, what he meant was that it was not an inherent reflex. The dog wasn't born with it. But because of training, the dog learned to associate a bell with food. So basically, in simple terms, what this meant was that the dog was able to learn. And anything that can learn has memory. Okay. Now, we know humans have memory, now animals have memory. What if we keep going down the evolutionary chain? What if we look at birds? Do birds have memory? You know that birds migrate. So sometimes they migrate thousands of kilometers in different seasons. And it has been found that even after migration, birds are still able to come back and find their nests. So somewhere in their brain, they're able to store the necessary information they need to come back after migration and locate their nests. So that means that they're able to store info and change their output. That is, change their movement according to the stored info. So that means that they have memory. What if we go still further down? What about rodents? So rats. Do rats have memory? The answer is again, yes. So what scientists did was they arranged an experiment. So they created a maze, and the maze had an entry point and an exit point. And in the maze, in one corner, they kept a block of cheese. And what they found was that a rat who enters the maze would first find an exit and then come out. But after a couple of tries, he would explore and he would find the cheese. And then after that, every time he entered the maze, he would directly go for the cheese. And this means that the rat remembers and he learns where the food is. So that means that he has memory. Okay. Suppose we go still further down. What about fishes? Now, sea creatures overall cannot be clumped into the same basket because there are mammalian sea creatures. Okay, so you can have, for example, there are sharks, there are dolphins. Now, these creatures actually are highly intelligent. So they don't just have primitive memory for food, but they have enough memory for even language and communication. And it's believed that dolphins even have a sort of social structure. So dolphins and sharks are quite highly evolved. But even lower fishes, non-mammalian fishes, uh, earlier it used to be believed that they don't have memory, they don't really retain information. But recently, research has shown that certain fishes have been studied. Now, for example, one research I read was about clownfish. I think I think Finding Nemo was about a clownfish, but and if so, that's a good way to remember because in clownfish they found that when two clownfishes mate and then they are separated for almost 30 days and then they are put together again in the midst of a lot of other fishes, they are able to recognize each other. So that means that even after a gap of time, if they're able to recognize each other specifically, then that means that they remember, and that means they have memory. So what this basically means is that while we talk about memory a lot, memory is not exclusive to human beings at all. In fact, you can go all the way down your evolutionary chain and you will still find that even your lower organisms also have memory. So one way that we could put this is that any living organism with a brain is able to store information and use that information to change outcome. And essentially, this is what we mean by memory. Now, how do we understand more about memory? So for that, you need to understand more about the brain. Because ultimately, from what we have seen so far, it looks like memory and the brain are closely connected. So now let's look at the human brain. And the human brain is, as you know, it can be complex, but we'll take it slowly. Okay. So this is the brain, And this is what you call as spinal cord, which is the extension of the brain that goes down your spine. And from the spinal cord, you have nerves. And finally, you have muscles. So the whole purpose of the nervous system is what we discussed in the very first minute, which is you need to have input, you need to process the input, and you need to have output. So the whole purpose of the nervous system is exactly the same. There will be input, which will enter the brain through some way. The brain will process that input and it will tell the spinal cord. The spinal cord will tell the nerves, and the nerves will tell the muscle, and ultimately the muscle will form some form of action, which is the output. Okay? Because if you think about it, every output that the human body gives is some form of muscle action. Okay? Now, this has nothing to do with memory, but just as a side note, every output that the human body has, think of all the outputs that we can have. We can have speech, we can move something with our fingers, we can walk with our legs. Any form of output that we have, any way of us interacting with the environment ultimately involves some muscle contracting somewhere. So when you're speaking, it's your vocal cord muscles. Or when you're moving something, it's your finger muscles, your hand muscles, your leg muscles are moving when you're walking. So in a very simple way, there is input through your senses and there is output through your muscles. And that is what the human body is primarily for. So let's look at this a little more differently. I'm going to draw the brain again here. Okay. And here, I'll give you a little bit of context. Suppose this is the face. Okay. Now, let's imagine what are the kinds of input that you can have. You can have sight. So through your eyes, going into the brain. You can have taste through your tongue, going into the brain. You can have sound, which is through your ears, going into the brain. You can have touch, which is through your hands, your feet, your face, going into the brain. And you can have smell, going into the brain. Now, the reason that I use smell last is because smell is unique in that smell is the only one that goes into the separate part of the brain. All the others will end up in a small egg-shaped area in the brain called as the thalamus. Okay. So your sight, your taste, sound, and sense of touch, all of them will end up in this area called as the thalamus. And only your smell will go to a different area. So that doesn't go to the thalamus. All right. So then what happens? Once it reaches the thalamus is basically like a traffic cop. So the role of the thalamus is to direct the flow of traffic into the correct area. So all these sensations that end up in the thalamus will guide it into where it should go. Okay, so you have different parts of the brain that is designed for different functions. So there's one part of the brain that only deals with things you see. There's one part of the brain that deals with things you hear, or things you touch, or things you taste. So different parts of the brain have their own responsibility, and is the role of the thalamus to guide those senses in the right direction. So just as a form of completion, I'm going to tell you which part of the brain does what. So essentially, there are parts of the brain called lobes. Okay, they are called lobes. And each part of the brain has a different role. So the first part of the brain is called frontal lobe. Okay, and the role of the frontal lobe is thinking. So your frontal lobe calculates, it thinks about what it has learned, uh, the your personality, your judgment, your insight, all of that is a part of the frontal lobe. The second part of the brain is called as the parietal lobe. Okay, so this is the parietal lobe, and the role of the parietal lobe is visuospatial, or let's put it just spatial because it might confuse. So it's spatial. So what does spatial mean? By spatial, you mean a knowledge of space. So it's the function of the parietal lobe uh, to understand your three-dimensional structure. So everything that you touch is sent to the parietal lobe so that you get the idea of what the shape is like, what the texture is like. And the parietal lobe has an idea of where you are sitting. So the parietal lobe is responsible for that. At the back of the brain is something called as the occipital lobe. And the role of the occipital lobe is seeing. So everything that you see, whatever that you see, the light, rays that are coming into your eyes, all those images are being sent directly to the occipital lobe. And it is a function of the occipital lobe to analyze what you're seeing. And finally, there is the temporal lobe. This is called temporal lobe. And the temporal lobe has a couple of functions. In terms of senses, the temporal lobe has a role in hearing. It also has a role in taste. Okay. So right now, that's what we will be talking about. And somewhere in the middle is your thalamus. And there is the thalamus on the other side, because as you know, your brain has two sides. So both sides have one thalamus. And so there are two thalami. Now, what we discussed just over here, we'll take that again in a slightly more clearer form. So there's the thalamus, and you have all these different areas. You have your parietal, you have occipital, you have your temporal, and you have your frontal. Now what happens is that all your senses enter the thalamus. So here I'm drawing all senses together. Okay. And the thalamus sends each sense into a different area. So it will send the light that is your sight, into occipital. It will send sound into your temporal lobe. It will send taste into your temporal lobe. It will send your sensation of touch into your parietal lobe. And all these areas will analyze this information that they just got. And once they have analyzed it, whatever they conclude, all of them will send that information to the frontal lobe. Okay, because as we discussed, it is the role of the frontal lobe to think and to analyze final outcome. So the frontal lobe will put together all this analysis that your parietal, your occipital, your temporal lobe have done, and all that information enters the frontal, and the frontal lobe will put it all together and come up with a plan of action. Okay, and that plan of action is what will ultimately turn into your output. Okay, so it is the role of the frontal lobe to ultimately control output. And as we discussed, your output means your muscle action. So that means that your frontal lobe is what will control all your muscles, and that is called as motor function. And the capacity to sense is called sensory function. So your brain has two main functions. One is sensory function and one is motor function. The sensory function will go to the thalamus, and the motor function, your frontal lobe is responsible for. Okay. Now, this is the overall idea of what the brain does. But where does memory come into this? So what happens after the frontal lobe has decided a plan of action is that the frontal lobe will, apart from telling your muscles what to do, your frontal lobe also sends information back to the thalamus. Okay, so if supposing you remove all the intermediaries and you have only the thalamus here and the frontal here, okay, and you've removed everything else. So ultimately what has happened, you have an input through your senses, and then the thalamus sends it to the frontal lobe via all your different lobes, and your frontal lobe has an output, but your frontal lobe will also tell the thalamus what it has done. So there is a memory pathway from your frontal to the thalamus, and it is the function of the thalamus now to send this final information to be stored as a memory. All right. Now, let us take a real life example. Suppose you are chatting on WhatsApp. Okay. You get a message and you reply, and then you forget about it. Okay. Now, this part of the action is done by your frontal lobe. So you get an input, you have an output, and then you forget about it. Your frontal lobe has done its job. But suppose you also remember that message, and next week you bring up that message in a conversation, which means that you have stored that message in your memory. This part of the action is done by your thalamus. But if you remember what we said, the thalamus is just a traffic cop. So the thalamus does not store memory in itself. It is not a hard drive. It does not store memory in itself. It only directs it to the correct place. So that means that there is another area which is responsible for storing memory. So what is that? Where does the thalamus send this memory to? And that part of the brain is called as the hippocampus. And this is the last bit of neuroanatomy that I will be discussing. I know that it might have gotten a bit too complicated. I hope it hasn't. If there are any doubts, you can just ask me on chat and I'll explain it again. But it is important that you understand which part of the brain does what, so that you get an overall picture of how memory is formed. And once you know how memory is formed, now we are talking about how memories are stored. Now, where is the hippocampus? So again, let's look at the brain. And you remember that this is your temporal lobe, and this was your thalamus. So your hippocampus lies somewhere here. Okay. And suppose you look at it from above. Okay. So now you are going above the brain and then looking down onto the brain. Then if you look at the thalami, you will see them as these egg-shaped structures. Okay. And so they sort of look like this. And you will see the hippocampus is somewhere in this area. And the beautiful thing about the hippocampus is that it's shaped like a seahorse. Okay. So this entire thing is shaped like a seahorse. And the origin of the word hippocampus is actually Latin for seahorse. So the first time that somebody cut open the brain and they looked at the hippocampus, they thought that it looked exactly like a seahorse, and that is why they called it hippocampus. Now, what is the role of hippocampus? As we discussed, your frontal lobes has sent a memory signal to the thalamus. Now, there is a part of the thalamus that is involved only in memory. That part of the thalamus sends a signal into the hippocampus. And that signal runs all the way through this channel and then comes back to the thalamus. Now, every time there is a signal that runs in this circuit, your hippocampus makes the memory a bit stronger. Okay. Now, the exact details of how the hippocampus makes the memory is still not conclusively proven. There are multiple theories. One of the theories is that each particular memory gets encoded into a particular kind of protein. Or another theory is that there are specific kinds of cells that encode specific kinds of memory. Like for example, wherever you are, you will still be able to find your way home. Now, that is a very specific memory. Where is your home is a very specific memory. And there's a theory that your hippocampus has something called place cells. So a place cell is, as you can get by the name, it remembers places. So if there is a place cell for your home, every time you want to go home, that place cell will become active and it will remind you where your home is. So these are all different theories, but the idea is that the more times a particular memory goes through the hippocampus like this, the stronger that memory becomes. So what is the significance? What does this mean finally? What it means is that, one, revision works. Now here we are talking about practical implications of all the things that we just discussed. The more number of times a particular signal or a particular impulse runs through your brain, the stronger that memory becomes. So in short, the more number of times you revise, the better you'll remember. But another more interesting and slightly more complex corollary to this fact is that memory is correlated. And what does this mean? So suppose I give you a memory of your school. Okay. Now, when I tell you to think of your school, there are multiple things that come to your brain. So one is you will have a visual image of your school. So you'll remember the school building, you'll remember the school grounds, you may remember the faces of different teachers. Now, these are all visual images, and they're all linked to the overarching memory of your school. So any one of those images will lead you to think of your school. The second is you may remember names. You may remember names of your friends. You may remember the name of your school. You may remember the name of that area in which your school was in. You may remember sounds. So you may remember the sound of your teacher's voice or the sound of children playing in the playground. Or you may have certain more visceral memory. So you may remember some painful memory or some joyful memory. So you may remember emotions. Now, each one of these things are actually stored separately. And when I think of school, I may remember one of these or I remember all of these. But what is interesting is that if I remember any one of these, there is a higher chance that I may, because I remember a visual image, I may end up remembering the names, the sounds, and the emotions. Okay? So this is what I mean by correlation, that memory is interlinked. So no one fact is isolated. Somewhere, all facts are interconnected. Okay? So these are two corollaries of what we've understood of memory. One is that revision works, and second is that memory is correlated. So this brings us to a very interesting theory about memory and mainly about learning, which is called as knowledge tree. Okay, so what is knowledge tree? Knowledge tree is that the theory that just what we discussed, if I give you an isolated fact, okay, if I tell you that there are 1500 tigers left in a forest, now that is a fact. There is a limited amount of time till where you can remember an isolated fact, and there are a limited number of isolated facts that you can remember. Now this figure will change with practice, with focus, but in general, an isolated fact is more difficult to remember. But suppose there are things that you already know. Okay, now these are known facts. Now you know that, for example, tigers are carnivores. You don't have to remember this. You already know it because at some point you have revised it so many times that that fact has run through your hippocampus so many times that it has now become your known knowledge. You already know it. You don't have to retrieve that information from anywhere. So the knowledge tree theory is that suppose you attach this fact to another fact that is already known, that is already part of a knowledge tree, and you make sure that this bond is strong. So suppose you make this bond strong, then eventually this fact will also become a part of your knowledge tree. Okay. And that is how you can keep expanding your fund of knowledge, in that everything that you get, any new information that you get, if you can link it up with something that you already know, then your memory, you find it easier to remember. All right. So that completes your basic neuroanatomy and how we remember and where we remember. We've spoken about how we can go down the chain of evolution, and we've talked about how even fishes can remember. What if we go further down? What if we go past the multicellular organisms and we go into unicellular organisms? Because we said that anything that has a brain can remember, but what about things that don't have a brain? Okay, so there are organisms such as amoeba. Okay, so an amoeba looks something like this, and it has a nucleus, it has a cell membrane, and that's pretty much it. So it doesn't have a brain, but what it does have is something called as a neural mesh or a neural net. Okay, so there is no central area that can store information. Like any organism which has a brain can store information, but organisms that don't have a brain don't have anywhere they can store the information. So what happens is that at the local level, there is input. So I'll just change this color. Yeah, so at the local level, there is input, and at the local level, there is output. So it's a very reactive existence. So you get an input and you react to it, and there is nowhere that you can store it, and there's no way that you can learn from experiences, because if you can't store information, how can you learn from experiences? So for a long time, we thought that amoeba and other unicellular organisms don't really have memory. But an interesting research recently came out, and they studied something called as slime mold, which is an amoeboid organism. And what they found was they again used a maze, and what they found was that so they let the slime mold go through, and they found that the slime mold was releasing a form of gelatinous substances intermittently. Okay, and the reason that it did that was because as the slime was moving across, every time it came across its own gelatinous slime, it was a way of knowing that I have been here before. And so it would avoid that and look for some other exit. And so it would avoid the areas that it has touched, and it would keep exploring new paths. And the researchers equated this with the example of, suppose there is a forest and you are lost in that forest and you don't know where you have to go. You may mark the trees. And then later on, you will use those marks as a way for you to remember. So what this means is that while your internal memory may not be enough, you have in a way outsourced your memory to the environment, and then you are using that outsourced memory for your own benefit. So the slime essentially outsources the job of remembering where it has been to the environment. So in a way, it is able to modify its output, and in a way you can say that it does have memory. And this has been an interesting finding. Let's take it even further. Let us go into an area where organisms are just a cell and nothing else, like bacteria, or even further down, viruses. Now, do these organisms have memory? Let's see. Both bacteria and viruses replicate. That is, they keep dividing. They enter into hosts. So like they enter into human beings, and then they exit, and then they again replicate, and then they enter into other hosts. So that is their life cycle. But we have seen that in both bacteria and viruses, if you give antibiotics or antivirals, which are chemicals that you give to kill these organisms, after a few generations, there is resistance. So the same bacteria and viruses that were susceptible, that were getting killed by those antibiotics and antivirals, after some time, we find that they are now resistant to those same chemicals. So in a way, you can say that the environment had an input, that is environment meaning antibiotics, and then the bacteria were able to change its output in some way, and now they are resistant. So according to our first definition, that the bacteria were able to use that information and change output, according to that definition, bacteria do have memory and viruses do have memory. The only difference is that in both the cases of bacteria and viruses, it happened not in the same generation, but across multiple generations. So here what we are talking about is genetic memory. So we are saying that in the same generation, they did not have the capacity to take in that information, change the output, and use it for their own benefit. But after 5 generations, 10 generations, maybe 100 generations, they were able to carry forward some genetic memory and ultimately bring about a change. So genetic memory is definitely a proven concept. And of course, you can imagine that if genetic memory exists in bacteria and viruses, it definitely exists in human beings as well. So the thing with memory is that it's difficult to go back. So if there is genetic memory in bacteria, then that means there is genetic memory all throughout the evolutionary chain. And if there is cellular memory in amoeba, then there is cellular memory all throughout the evolutionary chain. And if you go further up, if there is reptilian, if there is basic memory in reptiles and rodents, then there is that is there even in primates. So if you find or if you develop a form of memory, then that memory gets carried forward throughout evolution. So that brings us to genetic memory. And suppose now here we are stepping really deep down the rabbit hole, but if you take genetic memory and let's look at a gene, and this is a DNA, what we are basically seeing is that what is DNA basically? DNA is amino acids linked together in different ways. So there are different amino acids. There are 5 different types of amino acids in DNA and RNA. And they're all linked together in different ways. And the pattern in which they are linked together decides ultimately what that DNA or RNA will do. So it is almost like your binary code of 1 and 0. So the different patterns or different formations of 1 and 0 will ultimately mean something different. So similarly, different combinations of amino acids will lead into different DNA and RNA. And what we mean by genetic memory is that your amino acids remember to arrange themselves in a particular way. So when we say genetic memory, we are actually talking about amino acid memory. And in a way, what that means is maybe there is molecular memory. So certain amino acids remember to bond in a particular way because they remember that the last time they bonded in that way, the ultimate end result was better. So at a very, in a very small way, that is also a form of memory. And beyond this, I wouldn't go very lightly, but maybe if you keep going down, at some point, we may be talking about atomic memory or nuclear memory or even memory in quantum physics. Okay. So in quantum physics, people have already found that there are so there's something called as quantum spin. So there are quantum particles that spin in a particular way, and there's another quantum particle that spins in an opposite way. And even if you separate them by a big distance, if you change one spin, the other spin changes. So they are linked in a particular way. But now this is too way deep down the rabbit hole. So let's come back a little bit, and let's come all the way back into human beings. Now, in human beings, we talked about neural memory. That is the memory that our brain stores. Is there any other kind of memory that human beings have? So the other kind is immune memory. So what does this mean? Our immune system is a collection of cells that we use to fight against bacteria. Okay. And so if one type of bacteria attacks the human body, the immune system will quickly figure out what kind of bacteria it is, and it will attack it and kill it. And it will also create something called memory cells. So it's in the name. It's called memory cells. And the function of the memory cells is to remember this specific bacteria. And it will remember that this bacteria tried to kill me, and it will remember how to kill this bacteria in case it attacks next time.
Again.
Okay? Do you want me to explain this again?
No.
Okay. So you have neural memory and you have immune memory, and you also have other kinds of memory such as endocrine memory and gut memory. But at some level, both endocrine and gut, that is in your stomach and your intestine, that memory is also linked to your nervous system. So in a way, it is also a subsection of your neural memory. So I'm not going to talk about that separately. All right. So I think that completes our talk on memory. So just to recap, what all did we speak about? We talked about how memory is formed. We talked about how basically memory is formed because of input. and we process it, and then there is output. And in that processing, we store the information that we need so that we can use it the next time. We talked about how animals also have it, birds, rodents, even fishes. Then we talked about the neuroanatomy. We talked about the different types of lobes that are there in the brain and what each lobe does. And then we talked about how the thalamus is a traffic cop and it talks with the frontal lobe. And finally, how the thalamus sends the final information down to the hippocampus, which stores the memory for further use. And we talked about how running a same memory again and again through the hippocampus will make it stronger. And we talked about how memory is correlated, so different aspects of memory help each other. And we talked about knowledge tree, and then we went down the rabbit hole into unicellular organisms and is there memory there. Then we talked about genetic memory in bacteria and viruses, and then we briefly touched upon quantum physics, and then we talked about immune memory. Okay. And is there anything I wanted to touch? No, I'm going to look at the questions that people have asked. So Srinath has asked, what is the issue with people who are forgetful with names? All right. So now, whatever we have spoken about till now is memory in a normal person. Okay. So normal memory functions like this. So you're able to remember names, you're able to remember faces, you're able to remember sounds. Now, there is a different defect for every small thing that you are not able to remember. Okay. So supposing you can't remember names, that is called anomia. So you are unable to remember names. Okay. And suppose you are unable to, say, recognize faces. Then, so suppose you see somebody, say you look at Amitabh Bachchan's picture and you are not able to recognize who that is, then that is something called as prosopagnosia. And supposing you are not able to remember sounds, okay, then that is called auditory agnosia. Okay, so these are the different types of memory loss, and one of the commonest kinds of memory loss that we see is Alzheimer's. So in Alzheimer's, what happens is that your brain is otherwise normal, but deep inside in your hippocampus, and the areas of the brain where you remember names or where you remember places, you start losing those neurons. So those neurons start to die. Okay, so there is degeneration. So then you slowly start remembering what day it is. You start forgetting what day it is. You start forgetting whether you've had breakfast or not. You start forgetting where did you leave your car keys, and then slowly you start forgetting older things. So you start forgetting what your address is. You start forgetting how many children you have. So over a period of 5 to 10 years, because more and more neurons will keep dying, your memory goes more and more. Okay, so that is Alzheimer's. So another question that Abhin asked is, wouldn't the development of resistance be linked to the propagation of more resistant types of bacteria, while the easily susceptible ones are destroyed? Survival of the fittest. Absolutely. So the difference between human memory and bacterial memory is that a human being is able to try, there is trial and error in the same lifetime. So imagine somebody learning guitar. So the first time you learn the guitar, it sounds really bad, and you don't know how to play the chords. You don't know how to move your fingers. But if you keep trying, every mistake, your brain corrects itself, and then finally you figure out how to move. Like basically, you figure out how to modulate your output. In this case, how to modulate your finger output. In the case of a bacteria, each trial and error, uh, each error is death. So every time a bacteria tries, it'll probably try two different kind of combinations. And one combination will not work, and the other combination may work 25%. So the ones that will not work will obviously not carry forward, and the ones that will work will carry forward. And the next time, the one that will work only 25% will die, and the one that will work 50% will live, and so on. So the problem with genetic memory alone is that it will take multiple generations, whereas in a human being, uh, we are able to evolve within the same lifetime. So that is one of the biggest advantages of memory is evolution. So without memory, there is no evolution. And which is why it is important that we remember what we go through. Because if you forget what you go through, you are basically making it harder for yourself to evolve. So memory has led to evolution, and human beings and higher animals have the chance to evolve within our own lifetime. Uh, Also, Avin asked if this is not covered, but the concept of short-term versus long-term memory. Can someone have poor short-term but good long-term memory? Correct. So let's uh, draw the brain again, and let's look at the thalamus. Okay. So there is a sensory input, your frontal lobe, and your frontal lobe gives output. So what this basically means is that for a short period of time, your frontal lobe also remembers. And this is called as working memory. So for the time that your frontal lobe needs to plan its action, so whether that planning action is over a few seconds or microseconds or for a few minutes or longer, for that much time, the frontal lobe is able to hold information. So this is called as working memory, and this also leads to short-term memory. Whereas if you want to remember it for a long time, then the frontal lobe will send it to thalamus. The thalamus will send it to hippocampus. And hippocampus will cause long-term memory. So suppose there is a problem in only your frontal lobe, your short-term memory will go and your long-term memory will be okay. Whereas suppose there is a problem with only your hippocampus, then your long-term memory will go and your short-term memory will be okay. All right. So somebody's asked, how does photographic memory work? Is it genetic or can it be learned? Okay. So all forms of memory have a genetic component. Okay, because like I said, genetic memory has had, I think what, like 6 billion years of head start. Okay, so you can't escape from genetic memory. Genetic memory has been there throughout, but the advantage of human beings is that everything can be learned. So because of our frontal lobe, okay, because of our frontal lobe, and you may know that the frontal lobe is the most advanced part of the brain, and except for human beings and some chimpanzees and some dolphin species, no other organism has such a developed frontal lobe. So because of our frontal lobe, we are able to override almost anything that our more primitive brain does. Okay. Now this is a two-way street. If the frontal lobe is not very strong, so suppose people are, and this is what we mean by willpower, but uh, the primitive brain can very easily override the frontal lobe also, but it is a two-way street, and we at least have an option, whereas lower animals don't have that option of overriding their primitive primitive brain, but we have that option, so we should use it. uh, Coming to the question of photographic memory, uh, basically what photographic memory means is that you see a scene, you see a visual impulse, visual input, and that visual input goes uh, to the back of the brain, and from the back of the brain it will go to thalamus, and then it will get stored in the hippocampus, like via the frontal lobe, and then it will get stored in the hippocampus. Now suppose you keep practicing, this is called photographic memory, and if you keep practicing, this will also improve. So it is something that you have to focus on. So what does practice mean? Your frontal lobe has to be trained that all your visual impulses that you get has to be stored in the hippocampus. So if this training happens, then it will naturally become a loop. So if that training does not happen, for some people, it may be a genetic component, but this can be trained. All right. Is there any other question that you have? So Aniket has just asked me, how do we imagine much more in dreams? Okay, that's a very interesting question. So, and actually that is completely different from what we're talking about. But okay, since this is an open discussion, let's talk about that. So what happens in sleep? Uh, okay, so your consciousness, like your awake state, is here. Okay, your outer cortex is where you are aware, and as you go deeper and deeper, you enter more and more into your subconscious. Okay, and this area, this area is basically just your life functions. So it keeps you breathing, it keeps your heart rate running, it keeps your blood pressure normal. So this is your basic life function. So if this goes, then everything above it will stop. So what happens in sleep? So in sleep, your brain starts to shut down. So your cortex starts to shut down, and then the shutting down goes deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. Okay, and ultimately, only your only your brain stem. So this is the brain stem, and this area, which is your hippocampus, thalamus, and your limbic lobe. Now these are slightly active because these never completely shut down, or there is some small level of activity happening. So in a normal state, your in a normal state, suppose you are not asleep, your brain, your frontal lobe is able to control your limbic lobe and your hippocampus and your thalamus, and keep a keep a watch, like keep it under wraps. But suppose you are asleep, then your frontal lobe is, the watchman is not there, so your frontal lobe has gone off to sleep. So then whatever activity happens in your hippocampus and your thalamus gets sent all across. But it doesn't make sense. So it is not logically arranged, because your logic comes from your frontal lobe. Okay, your logic and your reasoning comes from your frontal lobe. So when you are normally in daytime, when you're imagining things and you're imagining a bus, your logic says that your bus has to be on the road, and the bus will take a right turn, left turn, whatever. But if you're asleep, your logic is gone. So if you imagine a bus, then that bus may be floating in the clouds, because these are random images that are coming into your hippocampus and then going away. So that is why there is no inhibition of your frontal lobe on top of your imagination. So that is why you dream all sorts of crazy things when you're asleep. Is there an age to begin memory loss? Coming to Alzheimer's usually starts beyond 70 to 80 years. Okay. And this is because as you grow older, there are uh, toxic things that are accumulated in the brain, and that accumulation goes on increasing as you grow older and older and older. So at one point, there is so many toxic things that are in your brain that your brain starts dying. Your brain starts getting degenerated. So in a normal scenario, Alzheimer's should not happen early unless there is a genetic component. So sometimes some of your genes have a problem. Okay, so your genes have a problem. So then the same toxins can get formed a lot more. Or the garbage removal mechanism. So every brain has a way to remove the toxins. So suppose that garbage removal is gone, then there will be more toxins, and so you can have even young people coming with memory loss. Okay. Any other questions? All right. So thank you so much for being a part of this talk. I hope you liked it. We are going to do this again next Sunday. We are going to be talking about music, and we'll be talking about how the brain understands music and what happens in the brain when we hear music, and why do we love it? Why do we love dance? Why do we love moving with music? So we'll be talking about that, and I hope that will be an interesting topic for you. And any other questions that you have, you can ask me on chat, and you can even ask me directly. I'll just unmute everyone. You can just ask me directly if there are any other questions. Okay, any exercises we can perform that will improve memory? So the same things that I told you, revising and correlating. So you run a signal impulse again and again through your hippocampus. The connections will be stronger, and you try and link up whatever you want to remember. You try and link it up to anything else, any other memory. You link it up, the bonds will be stronger. So imagine a fact that is hanging by just one thread versus hanging by 15 threads. So that bond will be much stronger. So the more you interconnect things, the more you will remember. And it's a good thing even otherwise, because as you go deeper into any field, whatever is your profession, as you go deeper into it, you realize that everything is interconnected. So economics is interconnected with civics and geography and history and medicine, and as you can see, neuroscience is interconnected with philosophy and evolution and sociology. So if you interconnect things, then you'll be able to remember things a lot more. I hope that helps. All right, so I think we have to wrap it up now. Any other questions you have, you can ask me on Twitter, or you can ask me on Facebook. And I'll be putting up this talk on YouTube. The channel's name is Siddharth Warrior. So you can find me there. You can share that video with anyone you want, and you can ask me whatever you want at the under the video as well. All right. Thank you so much.